So picture this. In one single week in August 2025, the White House just drops this flurry of documents. We're talking about everything from taxes to foreign policy and even the design of government websites. Okay, so let's dive in and see if we can piece together what this really intense week of communication tells us about the administration's agenda. And that's the big question, right? What story do all these official statements, fact sheets, and press releases tell when you put them all together? We're going to see what we can learn by looking at what they chose to talk about and, just as importantly, how they talked about it. All right, to make sense of it all, we've broken it down into 5 key themes that really stood out. The economy, which was a huge focus, global affairs, domestic policy, government reform, and finally, we'll try to tie it all together to see what the core message really is. Okay, let's kick things off with what was, without a doubt, the economic centerpiece. A huge chunk of the communication this week was all about a major push on taxes and investment. At the heart of this was something the administration is calling the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or OBBBA. Now, according to the White House documents, this law does 2 main things. First, it makes the 2017 tax cuts permanent, and second, it adds some new relief, specifically highlighting deductions for tips and overtime pay. So you're probably asking, what's the bottom line here? Well, the White House kept pointing to an analysis from the Tax Foundation, and the number they highlighted over and over was this: $3,752. That's what they say the average American taxpayer will see as a tax cut. But here's where it gets really interesting. They didn't just stick with the national average, they really localized the message. The documents went out of their way to highlight specific places, pointing to huge average cuts, like over $14,000 in Collier County, Florida, or more than $6,000 in Washoe County, Nevada. The goal seems to be to make that big national number feel really personal and local. And to back this up, the White House documents actually put together a collection of quotes from local papers. Take this one from the Reno Gazette-Journal. It was used to show, how these tax cuts in Nevada were being covered right there on the ground. And then the strategy kind of zooms out. They started using reports like this one from the Tennessean to paint a much bigger picture, framing this bill as the most significant tax policy overhaul in years. And they wrap it all up with quotes like this one from the Dallas Express. See how it brings it all together? It calls the bill the centerpiece of the economic agenda and emphasizes its stated purpose, providing historic relief for middle-class families. Now, it wasn't all about tax cuts. The documents also pushed this narrative of a massive investment boom. There was a release called Trump Effect, and it just lists these huge corporate commitments, Apple leading the pack with a reported $600 billion, to really showcase what they're calling a surge in U.S.-based investment. All right, so let's shift gears. Away from the domestic economy, the week's announcements also projected a really active foreign policy. This was focused on 2 main things: diplomacy in Ukraine and a new trade deal with Europe. The White House laid out the timeline pretty clearly. It kicks off with a meeting between President Trump and President Putin. Then there are efforts to get the leaders of Russia and Ukraine to meet directly. And it all leads up to a summit at the White House with President Zelensky and key European allies. And the documents were absolutely packed with quotes from world leaders, all presented as a kind of endorsement of this diplomatic effort. Here's one from NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, who gives President Trump direct credit for breaking what he calls a deadlock. And it wasn't just him. This quote from the German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, was also highlighted to really drive home that international reaction, saying that a path is open now for serious negotiations. Okay, so happening right alongside all that diplomacy was a huge trade announcement. A joint statement laid out a brand new framework with the EU, and the details are pretty significant. We're talking about getting rid of tariffs on U.S. industrial goods, plus some massive commitments on procurement and investment. Just look at this, a planned $750 billion in U.S. energy purchases alone. All right, let's head back to the home front, because the administration also put out documents on a whole range of domestic issues, really focusing on crime, immigration, and some of the ongoing cultural debates. So, for example, there was a press release for an initiative called Make D.C. Safe Again, and it presented these pretty stark statistics: a reported 83% drop in carjackings and a 22% cut in overall violent crime right there in the Capitol. When it came to immigration, the communications took a really forceful tone. Following a tragic accident in Florida, the Department of Homeland Security put out a statement that directly linked it to California's sanctuary policies, and then posed this very sharp, very direct question. And the administration also jumped into some cultural issues. A really long document was released that went into specific critiques of exhibits at several Smithsonian museums. It questioned displays on a range of topics, from white dominant culture to different interpretations of American history. Okay, so the last big theme that really popped up during this Packed Week was a focus on redesigning the federal government itself, specifically how it actually serves the public. And they framed this one in a really clear problem-solution format. A fact sheet laid it out. The problem: 26,000 federal websites, a lot of them aren't mobile-friendly, which adds up to a pretty bad user experience. The solution they proposed: an America by Design initiative, which would even include a new national design studio and a chief design officer. Another big initiative was something called a revolutionary FAR overhaul. Now, FAR stands for Federal Acquisition Regulation, which sounds complicated, but here's the bottom line. This whole thing is about streamlining how the government buys stuff. The goal is to cut through what they call non-statutory red tape and centralize the whole purchasing process.
Okay, so when you take a step back and look at everything that was announced in just 1 week, the tax cuts, the diplomacy, the domestic policy, the government reforms, what's the big picture here? You start to see a really distinct, multi-pronged agenda coming into focus.
Throughout all these documents, the administration often used really aspirational language, talking about a coming golden age. And that really leaves us with a final question to think about. What are the implications, the challenges, the potential outcomes of an agenda that's trying to push for massive economic change, redefine America's role on the world stage, and drive a major cultural and structural renewal at home, all at the same time?